Welcome to the Multiverse of Misinformation, a podcast about misinformation and the way it affects the many facets of our life, produced by the California Center for Ethics and Policy, or CCEP, at Cal Poly Pomona, and generously supported by the Cal Poly Pomona Special Projects for Improving the Classroom Experience Grant Program. My name is Sean Herron, Associate Librarian at Cal Poly Pomona, Faculty Fellow with CCEP, and host for this season of our podcast. Beyond the classroom, CCEP hosts a series of forums, panels, and discussions throughout the semester dealing with the chosen topic for that particular year and topics associated with it. On March 18, 2024, CCEP hosted a panel titled Author Meets Critics, in which Desiree Lim, Assistant Professor in Philosophy and Research Associate at the Rock Ethics Institute, discussed her recently published book, Immigration and Social Equality, The Ethics of Skill-Selective Immigration Policy. Dr. Lim completed her Ph.D. in Philosophy at King's College London and was a post-doctoral fellow at the McCoy Center for Ethics in Society at Stanford University. The panel of critics who reviewed Dr. Lim's book were as follows: Dr. Itzel Garcia, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Cal Poly Pomona; Leonel Alvarez-Ceja, a Ph.D. student in philosophy at the University of California, Irvine; and Luis Gama, a philosophy major at Cal Poly Pomona and one of the 2024 CCEP Ethics and Policy Fellows. We ask that, if you like what you hear or if you care about these issues, to please share our podcast with your friends, family, and colleagues. And now, with no further ado, here is the recording of the March 13th CCEP panel, Author Meets Critics, Dr. Desiree Lim and Immigration and Social Equality, The Ethics of Skill-Selective Immigration Policy.
Hello and welcome to an Author Meets Critics session with Professor Desiree Lim on her new book, Immigration and Social Equality, The Ethics of Skill-Selective Immigration. My name is Alex Matva, and I'm director of the California Center for Ethics and Policy, which is part of the College of Letters, Arts, and Social Sciences here at Cal Poly Pomona. We're very excited to sponsor today's event in collaboration with CPP's Philosophy Club and the Office of Government and External Affairs. First, we'll hear from Professor Lim, an assistant professor in the Department of Philosophy and a research associate in the Rock Ethics Institute. Dr. Lim completed her Ph.D. in philosophy at King's College London, including a stint as a Norman Malcolm Fellow at Cornell University. She was then a postdoctoral fellow at the McCoy Center for Ethics in Society at Stanford University. Her pioneering new book, Immigration and Social Equality, argues that many existing immigration practices, particularly those that give preference to so-called high-skilled over so-called low-skilled migrants, are unjust from the standpoint of social equality. They fail to treat people with equal respect and dignity that all human beings deserve. Next, we'll hear from our three critics from today's session. First up will be Dr. Itzel Garcia, an assistant professor of philosophy here at Cal Poly Pomona. Next will be Leonel Alvarez-Ceja, a PhD student in philosophy at the University of California, Irvine. And finally, we'll hear from Luis Gama, a philosophy major and ethics and policy fellow at CCEP. Before I hand things over to Dr. Lim, I wanted to let people know now to mark their calendars for the final event CCEP will be hosting this spring. On Thursday, April 11th from 11:30 a.m. to 12:45 p.m., we'll be hosting an interdisciplinary panel in this same room on psychological and structural approaches to combating misinformation. Some of our panelists are in this room as well. That includes CPP librarian Sean Herron and philosopher Tiffany Zhu, and we hope to see you there. There will be a post-event survey that we hope you all fill out. And to encourage you to do so, we actually have a signed copy of Dr. Lim's book. So in about an hour, I'll post the link for you to start filling out the post-event survey. Okay, to stay up to date with everything we've got planned, please sign up for our mailing list. Follow us on all the socials. We got all the links and stuff up here. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Lim and our critics.
Just talking.
Okay. Can everyone hear me? Fantastic. So thank you so much for coming to this event. It's been quite a while since I was in a room that was this well attended, so I'm really touched. And thanks to Alex for putting this all together. It's been such an honor to be here. So I guess I'll begin the panel by giving you not an exact, precise summary of the book, but what I take to be the key contributions that I'm trying to make in just like the overall narrative, but also like in the chapters that follow. And so I think the first thing that I want to put forward about the book is that I began by focusing on skill categories and how migrants are often uncritically divided into highly skilled migrants and low skilled migrants. So I want to make clear that I don't buy into that distinction. I think it's problematic for a whole bunch of reasons that I'm happy to talk about during the Q&A. But I felt that I had to work within that framework in order to reach a broader audience. And what perplexed me most of all was that there was a clear preference being shown for highly skilled migrants over low skilled migrants, even though I think there is a place for both categories of migrants, like in the economy, and arguably migrants who are considered low skilled have proven much more essential to the economy than highly skilled migrants like myself. Like, was a philosophy professor going to be designated an essential worker during the pandemic? Hell no. Like, right. So that's very much how the project even came to begin, as just like a seed in my mind of something that I really want to write about. And so the reason why it began to be framed as a book fundamentally about social equality was that in working through different conceptions of justice, I found myself aligning most with social or relational egalitarianism. So that's the basic idea that in the most just society, we would relate to each other as social equals rather than being in a society of superiors and inferiors, where some people have to cater and like to others and have arbitrary power exercised over them. Whereas my vision of the ideal society is one where we can look each other in the eye and not feel that we are superior or inferior to one another. So if anyone's read anything by Philip Pettit, he's got this amazing book on republicanism, and he talks about something called the eyeball test, which is when you can look somebody in the eye and not feel any kind of charged, social relation going on. And so I found that very amenable as a framework for the book and my primary concern about high-skilled and low-skilled migrants, which I took to be an objectionable hierarchy. So that really is the motivating force for the book. And so in terms of how the chapters are laid out, so it's systematic in the sense that I first have a section where I present the grounding argument and why I thought I needed this grounding argument. And if you look at much of the literature on immigration, or at least the lit at the time, which was quite a while ago, given that this began as my dissertation project in like 2013, much of the objections to states' right to exclude hinge on arbitrariness and how it's morally arbitrary in the style of Rawls to prevent people from entering a state and accessing equal opportunities simply on the basis of their citizenship and the birthplace, which is not something within their control, and therefore morally arbitrary in the way that gender, race, religion, sexual orientation, sexual identity all are. And even though I found that to be somewhat persuasive, right, especially if you're a Rawlsian, something I found missing from it was that many kinds of social inequalities obtain not because of arbitrariness in itself, but because of the very nature and content of socially subordinated identities. And one example I use in the book is just think about, there's so many case studies to draw on, but think about cases of, say, gender discrimination. When they occur, I think the main mechanism at work here is not that, well, you're facing unequal treatment because you were born a woman against your will, which you get no control over, and therefore some kind of corrective justice is needed. Rather, it's something about being a woman, right? That makes you, that makes other people see you in a certain kind of light, and therefore more likely to discriminate against you and treat you in ways that are not completely like totally inappropriate in some regards. And so that was what really caught my attention and made me think that I had to really design an account of what it meant to be socially subordinated, what it meant to be a social unequal, and why it was so important that we have social equality as one of the primary goods, in our lives, living in a flourishing and just society. And the argument I make for that is very simple. There's a more complicated way of putting this, but I'll try to give you the TLDR version of it, which is that our identities are fundamentally social. We require social uptake by others in order to realize our identities. And if we are persistently socially subordinated and we're seen only in terms of negative stereotypes, that's going to foreclose all kinds of possibilities for being seen for who we truly are. And again, that's something I'm happy to go into more detail in during the Q&A, especially if you're pressed on this. So that's basically the grounding argument for why I think social equality is so important. And then moving on to the second section, that's where I get into the topic of discrimination, which, as you may recall, was what got me into this project in the first place, which is that I began to see the treatment of low-skilled migrants as a kind of wrongful discrimination. And even though I use a particular account of discrimination that hinges on discrimination being wrong when it's performed on the basis of socially subordinated identity, you can plug in and basically any definition of discrimination. You don't have to agree with mine. I think you would still come up with the conclusion that low-skilled migrants are wrongfully discriminated against. And that's something I flesh out in quite a lot of detail in Chapter 3. And Chapter 4, I talk about indirect discrimination. So cases where discrimination is not explicit or in your face, but rather takes a far disparate impact, and how, and even though I've explored this idea of disparate impact, I think further on in the book, my focus in Chapter 4 is how skill categories lead to a disparate impact on women in particular. So that's the first 4 chapters condensed. And then in the final 2 chapters, it's a relatively short book, and I think there was a lot more I could have said, but short books are, I think, sometimes a lot more digestible than long ones. Who's read all of A Theory of Justice? I did, but not very well, I think. And so the last 2 chapters focus on, well, now that we, if you agree with me, the way immigration policy is designed is profoundly unjust. So what do we do about it? Or rather, what kind of appropriate frameworks are there at our disposal to understand what's going on? And so I thought that using a decolonial lens would be immensely helpful for just our understanding what's going on with those skilled workers and those skilled migrants in particular. And even though there are other things in the chapter, I guess I want to highlight the point that I think that the current system of bringing in low-skilled migrants under really dominating and really just inexcusable circumstances reproduces what I consider to be the fundamental structure of colonial injustice, where a group of people on the basis of their race are relegated to a certain set of roles, or even like a caste within the society, and are forced to work within those confines. So that's Chapter 5. And in Chapter 6, I consider the topic of migratorial disobedience. This I think is my favorite chapter. It was the last one that I wrote before handing in the book. And I talk about the circumstances under which it's permissible for migrants to disobey immigration laws. And I have a very permissive view on this. I argue that it's totally cool and even desirable, not just permissible. I want to draw a clear distinction there. It's not just okay. I think it's actually desirable that migrants disobey immigration law, because that attends to what I call a democratic deficit, where we are in a country where the very idea of proposing open borders or even significant immigration reform is somehow just off the table. And if you talk about it in, political debates, like leading up to elections, like that's like not going to win you any votes, because that's just the kind of society we currently live in. And so I think that cases like the migrant caravan from El Salvador, for example, are great cases where they actually bring attention to the problem and have people think about it in more detail, in a way that ordinary civil disobedience cannot account for. And there's also a pretty fun part where, like, I talk about throwing rocks at border agents. Just happy to talk about that as well. And yeah, I think that's pretty much my own takeaway from my project and the book. And again, I'm happy to answer any questions you might have during the Q&A. And I'm really excited for my comments.
Your chapter 6 was also my favorite, and my comments are largely about that. So, migration raises many social, economic, and political questions that philosophy as a discipline is well suited to diagnose and answer. The central philosophical question of Lim's immigration and social equality is whether skill-selective immigration policies can be morally justified in non-ideal societies like ours. By employing her social egalitarian framework, Lim convincingly argues against such policies. In this framework, people have the right to be treated as social equals and to be protected from unintentional and indirect subordination. Importantly, this right cannot be restricted by one's location or citizenship status. Therefore, states and individuals have a duty to recognize the social equality of non-citizens. In the first 4 chapters, Lim helpfully elucidates how skill-selective policies fail to do exactly that in both direct ways, through undermining the sense of self of low-skilled workers, and indirect ways, via reinforcing unjust racial and gender hierarchies. Lim's analysis of these topics show us that how the liberal social egalitarian framework can be used as a measure to fix the historical and ongoing legacy of colonialism in a world that was and is rife with unjust immigration policies. This is a traditional philosophical framework which has historically been used to justify these very injustices. For example, Thomas Hobbes argued for the existence of the state of nature by referencing the Native Americans that English settlers met when colonizing North America. We know that Native Americans have and had complex political systems. The Iroquois, for example, have been recognized by the U.S. Congress for devising federalism. Yet Hobbes depicts them as living in a constant state of insecurity and warfare, an argument later used to justify colonization by the English. But a remarkable consequence of Lim's work is that she shows us how this traditional philosophical framework actually leads to radical consequences. This session is supposed to be an author meets critic, but I'm afraid Lim is not going to find a critic in me. My only gripe with this monograph is that she does not fully acknowledge the groundbreaking implications of her conclusions. I believe, for example, that her social egalitarian framework could forcibly be used to justify open border policies. These are policies that impose minimal or no restriction on the movements of people and goods across borders. The existence of borders could reasonably be argued to violate social equality in similar ways as skill-selective immigration policies do. Perhaps Lim is not giving herself enough credit, but I strongly suspect that her decision not to defend open borders is a pragmatic move for the sake of people, for the sake of seriously engaging with people less ready to give up borders and the concept of authority than me. Okay, yeah, I figured you could confirm or deny. The most striking example of Lim's non-engagement with the radical import of her views occurs in Chapter 6, which she begins by distinguishing between permissive and restrictive views on migratorial disobedience. The permissive view states that people have no duty to obey unjust immigration laws when disobedience would protect the basic rights of migrants. According to the restrictive view, disobedience is permissible only when laws are egregiously unjust. That is, when they directly violate the human rights of non-citizens or when they allow states to shirk their required share of international responsibility for non-citizen human rights. Lim argues for a wider conception of egregious injustice that accounts for the ways that global structural injustice may indirectly violate basic rights, even through laws that we might consider otherwise just. Her argument here recalls the argument of Martin Luther King Jr. makes in Letter from Birmingham Jail, where he writes that just laws used unjustly are themselves unjust. I see no reason for Lim to call these injustices indirect instead of direct injustice. Perhaps this is a microcosm of my critique for increasing the forcefulness of her views. More broadly, Lim's argument could, and in my view should, be used to argue against the legitimate political authority of states that enact egregiously unjust laws and policies. If these laws and policies defeat the legitimacy of law, then it would follow that these laws have no authority and there is no moral duty to obey such laws. This tight conceptual connection between legitimacy, justice, and authority, however, makes it difficult to explain why the defeat of migrants' moral duties to obey would be localized. Legitimacy requires justice, and Lim is correct that, and I think she is correct, that egregious injustices occur regularly and structurally in our immigration system. It's not clear why we would question only the illegitimacy of egregious immigration laws and not the legitimacy of the powers enacting these laws. The Trump administration's zero tolerance approach, for example, systematically separated families attempting to cross the border illegally or seeking asylum. Children were placed in detention facilities while their parents faced prosecution for illegal entry or other immigration-related offenses. This policy is a clear example of an egregious injustice. Surely disobedience to it would be justified under Lim's framework. But how do we make sense of disobeying legislative acts enabling this policy without also questioning whether we owe any obedience to the United States in the first place, because they enacted this policy? Lim's view focuses on migrant disobedience, but citizenship status aside, her view allows us to question the legitimacy of the entire state. Once the legitimacy of the state apparatus as a whole is in question, we should begin to doubt the existence of any moral duties to obey the laws of such states. So there's a good reason for not taking the argument there. Though she doesn't explicitly state this anywhere in the book, she probably wants to maintain that despite serious moral failings in the legal system in states like the United States and the UK, they maintain some legitimacy. Meaning in light of egregious injustice, it might be permissible for migrants to break laws prohibiting their entry, but that doesn't mean that I, a U.S. citizen, am allowed to disobey laws applicable to me on the same grounds. It might be justifiable for a migrant to break U.S. laws by lying to immigration enforcing agents, but it's less clear how that logic of disobedience might also apply to me. This conclusion, however, would suggest a particularized conception of legitimacy that I feel morally uncomfortable with. Why should it matter whether the egregious injustice affects me in particular or not? I might have moral reasons to refrain from lying to an immigration officer. Perhaps I morally owe it to my fellow citizens not to, or I ought to care more about preserving social stability. But then my reasons for complying with the law stem directly from moral imperatives and not from the legitimacy of the laws of the state that commits these egregious injustices. One could rewrite Dr. King's famous phrase to say, illegitimacy anywhere is a threat to legitimacy everywhere. If that is not the case, we need an account of how states might preserve legitimacy in some areas but not others. In the absence of such an explanation, Dr. Lim's conclusions imply much more radical forms of resistance than she has suggested in this book. Thank you.
So much like Itzel, I'm also not much of a critic when it comes to the book. I found it super illuminating and actually quite responsive, I think, to a lot of experiences of people in this country. And I, for one, having family who is undocumented, seeing this kind of labor division, indeed, I think it was a really great piece of philosophical text that I think contributes in a way that perhaps otherwise philosophy hasn't really been too aware of. So my particular comments are going to be on Chapter 5, Part 3, and the title's called Decolonial Justice and Immigration Policy. And I'm particularly concerned with perhaps just kind of like looking at the scope of some concepts and seeing if there are some consequences down the line that follow from the arguments you give. So just to kind of show you what I'm talking about, I have to read this paper, which I'm not a fan of. So I hope I don't sound too robotic. So there are several aspects of this chapter with which I agree, along with areas where I seek further clarification and understand of concepts. To start, I'll address the points of agreement. So first and foremost, I agree that there exists a moral imperative for developed countries, particularly those that were former colonizers, to address and rectify the historic injustices that they've caused. It's acknowledged that this is a complex undertaking, as Lim emphasizes the importance of decolonial approach to immigration justice. One that not only seeks to readdress grievances in historically colonized groups, but also works to prevent the perpetuation of colonial injustice among people. Additionally, I concur with Lim's response to the brain drain objection, and that's one of the central parts that I'm going to be focusing on before I talk about other areas. And the brain drain is discussed in the chapter, and it refers to this objection, a concept discussed that states that there's this phenomena where developing countries lose their highly skilled workers to developed nations, often former colonizers, which attract these skilled individuals. And while the brain drain is indeed a valid concern, I ponder whether a comprehensive approach to corrective justice could incorporate elements of both addressing the possible lack of high-skilled labor in developing countries, while still allowing people the autonomy to move where they please. And as a consequence, not capping or limiting the number of immigrants from developing nations for fear of brain drain, right? And, of course, financial support to developing nations. I wonder if that perhaps is some kind of aspect to consider. But is there potential for a system that balances the need of parties, perhaps through mechanisms that ensure developing countries are not depleted of their skilled labor force? To a certain degree, I feel as if the alternative, which is direct aid to developing nations, possibly, is curtailing, as Lim mentions, the autonomy of individuals, that is, to move freely if they choose to. Furthermore, I appreciate Lim's response to the objections regarding brain drain once again, when there's an emphasis about the pursuit of opportunities that people have this kind of right to. Take, for instance, the case of Nigerian doctors. They have the freedom to choose whether to leave or to stay, and that represents a form of corrective justice whereby colonial countries provide opportunities, or ex-colonial countries, provide opportunities for those that they have historically subjugated to access better options and uphold their rights. Moreover, I believe that objections related to the brain drain, as I've actually heard, can be manipulated by anti-immigrant rhetoric, which often disguises itself as a moral standpoint. So there's like this faux moral standpoint where it's like, well, stay in your country. Don't you want to make it better? But in reality, it's very much an argument that's focused on, well, I don't want you in my country, so I'm going to try to take this moral high ground and say, coward, stay in your country, make it better. And I feel like that's missing the point entirely from what exactly is the problem here. And I wonder if we can kind of if we can get a clear scope on how we treat that kind of lack of high-skilled labor without necessarily imposing too much, without being too overbearing on individuals' rights as autonomous agents, as autonomous beings. Can they move? Should they stay? And also, do states have the power to do that? So do states have the power, whether that's their home state? So, for example, could my parents' home state, my parents' home country, could Mexico say, no, don't leave the country. We need these high-skilled people here. And that seems like it's odd, because then it brings in the question of whether or not you have like this kind of obligation, this kind of like a classic philosophical question of how much obligation do you have to those countries, to your own country. But at the same time, a developed nation could come in and say, well, we can go ahead and check this. We can see when we're bringing in too many immigrants, and then kind of correct the own country. And both sides just seem to be kind of weird. But then if you allow people to move freely, there was also just a problem of brain drain. So just trying to understand that concept to me is interesting. But also, I think moving on from the brain drain, because I could spend too much time on it. Also want to understand if at the core, perhaps, of this critique on high-skilled versus low-skilled labor and the stratification, if there's perhaps an argument to be made about colorism, I think. Because take, for instance, Latinos, take, for instance, Mexican folk. There are cases where there are a lot of white-passing Mexican folk. And it's not the case, I think, that these white-passing Mexican folk will be racialized in the same way that people of color from Mexico, whether that's mestizo people or indigenous people. Also, is it the case that if the white-passing Mexican worker works as, let's say, one of the low-skilled jobs, do they have a right to this kind of like justice that's seeked for people of color who work these low-skilled jobs from Latin countries? So there's an argument to be made about colorism, I think, here. Because it'd be strange to say, well, this person who has white passing is from Mexico, who reaps a lot of benefits in Mexico for this white passing, has the same kind of stake that people of color do. So I wonder if there's something we have to address with colorism. But also, and this might be me taking it beyond the scope of this book, I see a lot of parallels actually with with the prison system, or at least inmates, prisoners. Given that you mentioned earlier that identities are socially constructed, I believe that it's also the case that oftentimes people who are in the prison system and they go through a rehabilitation process or whatnot, and they come back into society already have this stigma of being criminals forever. And that, in a way, is also socially constructed, such that the person can have totally different beliefs, be completely regretful, have shame for what they've done, and corrected their actions, and completely for being a productive member of society. But society will still perceive you such as a criminal because you were in prison. And even while they're in prison, oftentimes there is this kind of stratification where if they do labor there, or if they come out, they're also stratified to do labor in the same way that is required of low-skilled workers because of this social tie that they had for making a mistake and being in prison for some time. But that also has ties, I think, to like school-to-prison pipelines. I wonder if perhaps that there's something here where it connects to something perhaps deeper in that's systematic, that is not just something that is colorism or the stratification of high-skilled and low-skilled workers, but more about the social construct of what it means to be othered in society. And if that also kind of puts you into this category of low-skilled workers. And I guess lastly, too, is there anything to be said? I think it's, you probably touched on this, but is there something to be said about domestic workers of color who are working these low-skilled jobs that are not immigrants per se? And that kind of ties back to this kind of concept of colorism. So I wonder if there is, at the foundation, some notion of colorism there, or racialization based off color, too. And I think I've exhausted my points. Thank goodness, because this was too long. So, yeah, I think those were my concerns. But I love the book, so thank you so much.
I don't mean to bore everyone. I'm going to go on kind of the same point. I'm going to take it a little further, though, on the chapter 5. So just looking background, this semester I've had the pleasure of participating in a faculty-student reading group with Dr. Madva, Corey, Dr. Itzeb. And it's been really, really nice. For a lot of us, we haven't read a whole lot on the philosophy of immigration, so this is kind of the first time I've taken a stab at it, and it's been really enlightening. As a student of philosophy generally, I also want to say thank you so much for making it so easy to read. I think the arguments were explicit, the writing was super clear, and the examples given really illustrated the points really nicely. The book inspired me also in other ways. So I'm a student fellow for the CCEP, and part of that, we have to produce a podcast that centers on something to do with the topic for the year, which is misinformation and democracy. So after reading the book, I was kind of inspired to do a little bit more digging into immigration and examine the kind of demeaning rhetoric that people often employ when speaking about migrants, and especially low-skilled migrants. I think that's something that was really important that the book touches on. So thank you for being a pioneer on the topic for me. I really appreciate it. Turning to my comments, a recurring subject that we kind of had a lot of the time is discussing the desire for the objections that you raise to your own view to be hashed out a little more fully or taken to like the logical ends. So that's the subject of my comments today. Like Leo said, I'm going to focus on Chapter 5, Decolonial Justice and Immigration Policy, where Dr. Lim explores the question of what a decolonial ethics of migration would look like. So in particular, Dr. Lim examines the question of what duties colonizing powers might have to ex-colonies through a decolonial ethic and how that should manifest. So what should we be doing to further the decolonial mission? So the obligations for the colonial states, of course, stem from the history of exploitation of people, their labor and their resources around the globe that were used in building these colonial empires, which continues to this day. So what do we do about it? If colonizing states owe reparations to colonized states, what form should that take? In the section on inclusion as a form of corrective justice, Dr. Lim explores one answer, that migration ethics might include an option for citizens of ex-colonies to have a kind of free movement between the country they were born in and the country that exploited them as a colony as a form of reparations that aims towards equalizing their opportunities. So in this, there's no formal requirement for the citizen of that ex-colony to move to the colonial seat. It's just a right that would be recognized and respected by the colonial state. So then the question kind of evolves into, why is this the reason? Why is the free movement between those two countries an entry into the colonial power? Why is that the answer to decolonial justice? So there are two objections that are raised to the view. I want to talk about the first one just really quickly, and then the second one is going to be kind of the one I want to dig into more. So one of them is financial contributions instead of inclusion in the polity. So colonizing states could, instead of like requiring or respecting the right for people to move to the colonial seat. They could instead just give financial assistance to ex-colonies rather than allowing the free movement to resettle. Dr. Lim responds to that by saying, sending money back to the ex-colonies doesn't really sufficiently appreciate decolonial justice. I completely agree with that. I think that's totally right. We cannot, with the wave of a wire transfer, just create similar economic opportunities or institutions that the colonial powers have come to enjoy, which is a direct result of the exploitation of those colonies. So the biggest thing I want to talk about is the argument from autonomy, which has to do with the brain drain. So a major worry is that the free movement of people from the ex-colonies to the colonial seat is that the ex-colonies are robbed of trained, skilled, educated folks. So that's what brain drain is, when all those skilled people move to the colonial power. So in other words, the people that ex-colonies need for their development leave the country. So if we have doctors, engineers, servants, construction workers, agriculture workers, if all those people just leave, how can the state develop? And then the question becomes, are the victims of colonization overall worse off if that free movement is granted? So Dr. Lim's response is prefaced by saying there's no requirement for people in the ex-colonies to migrate. Instead, it just gives them the option and the right is respected. So she also agrees that it might be morally wrong for an individual to leave their country to pursue those better opportunities at the colonial seat, but the state is still preserving that right nonetheless. So the focus, again, is on respecting the autonomy of the individual. To be sure that brain drain, it doesn't have the kind of negative effects that Leo was talking about. We might consider admittance policies that are sensitive to brain drain. So if we have too many doctors coming here from Nigeria, we might limit how many doctors we allow into the US, just so that they still have people that they need to develop the country. So that would establish kind of quotas for certain occupations, and we could change our admittance policies to reflect the harm that migration is doing. That, however, it seems really close to a skill-selective immigration policy, and the broader argument of the book is that skill-selective immigration policies are often discriminatory and unjust. It also seems like the colonizing state still gets to tell the ex-colony what's better for them. So we're still telling them, like, no, you guys need to keep all those people there. So my reluctance has to do with the argument of autonomy, like I said, though states respect the autonomy of the individuals in this view. I have two questions about it. So first, is it a fair choice at all? And the second question is, what are the consequences of moving to the colonial seat? So the first question, if the choice is between, you stay in your country of origin and you commit to doing the hard work of building or developing a polity that agrees to a common conception of the good, and you have to build up all those institutions to fulfill that need, or you and your family and everyone, they can leave. They can migrate to the US and all that work is essentially done. So you join an existing system with established institutions and workplace opportunities and whatever, everything is already done. Is that really a choice? So on first brush, it seems like the people who commit to staying are doing something supererogatory, so they're going above and beyond their moral obligations. But at the same time, we still can't assign any blame to the people who choose to leave. Just to restate, the response to brain drain is that we're not requiring people to leave, but that we're respecting their autonomy to make those decisions. But in many cases, that choice is radically constrained in a lot of ways. So you might have a refugee fleeing for their life, or maybe just someone moving for economic reasons, but the choice still seems imbalanced either way. If it's not a choice, are we still respecting or empowering their autonomy? So maybe the answer here is that colonizing states have just greater obligations than permitting free movement, so they need to do something more than just saying, okay, we respect your right to relocate. But even if we grant that, my second question is then, what are the consequences of moving to the colonizing state? So the aim's not to sound paternalistic, and I know, like Leo, what you were saying, it's not to sound paternalistic, it's to question the kind of moral damage that might come along with entering a colonial state, since a lot of the citizens of the colonial powers are typically not welcoming of migrants, no matter if they were an ex-colony or have a shared culture with whatever country was the colonizing power at the time. They're typically not very hospitable. So are individuals worse off in social equality terms when they migrate to the US, given that the environment is typically hostile to migrants and their cultures, which may ultimately hinder their pursuit of the good? That's a bet.
So I was thinking, maybe we could take like a 5-10 minute break for people to snack up, use the restroom, which is right outside, and then we'll hear Dr. Lim's response to these really insightful comments. So Hey, welcome back, everybody. We still have lots of snacks in the back, so please help yourselves. Lots of coffee and water as well. So we will, the beginning of the middle will be Dr. Lim replying to the comments, and then our critics and Dr. Lim might have a little bit of back and forth, and then I'll be running around with the mic for your questions. And folks who are playing at home on Zoom, please feel free to type your questions in the chat, and we will make sure to give them an airing here.
Okay, so I want to begin by thanking my critics. It's very hard to explain to people outside the philosophical context that, hey, I'm going to this event and I'm going to meet really cool people who are going to totally roast and like diss my book, and like it's like what you want. But I think this was a perfect example of that, where the comments given were like really, really helpful and generative, and I hope I can do justice to them and my comments. And if I don't, then definitely feel free to chime in as much as you want, and like, you know, push me to my very limits before I like freak out and like run away from this room. So I'll respond to them in chronological order, and then I think I'll become a bit more thematic, especially when it comes to the brain drain stuff, since there is quite a bit of overlap in that regard. So you were totally on point about how I did not go to like the most radical conclusion, which I possibly could, for a bunch of practical and editorial reasons. But I will reinforce that point by saying that I think, right, if I had to like tell you what my true views on immigration were, I would say that I definitely lean open borders, even though I make a point of saying I don't want to take a stance on that in the book. And I do think that, particularly when you look at immigration enforcement and how it's practiced, those are really serious sites of social inequalities and the reproduction of further inequalities. My colleague Jose Mendoza has done like some really great work on this topic, on enforcement in particular. And you can meet him at the APA if you're going to go there this week. So, and I think that in itself could give us a pretty strong argument in favor of open border policies. If we truly are committed to being social egalitarians, if we buy into this picture, then we have strong reasons to not enforce border policies, simply because I just don't see any world in which they do not reinforce like serious and really damaging social inequalities. So I'm totally with you on that. And so you also pushed me on the distinction I make between direct and indirect injustice that I make in the chapter on migratory disobedience. And so there I wanted to explain a bit more to the audience. I wanted to make clear that there were cases of immigration policies that would have immediate, direct, harmful consequences for immigrants. And I think a clear example of that, which you alluded to, was family separation policy. I think that's direct in the most unambiguous sense. You're literally separating parents from their children at the border. And I have a paper, the revisions are long overdue, that talks about that in some detail, so I can keep you appraised. Whereas for an indirect example of injustice, I talk about a case where, while the law itself does not make for a clear injustice of that very nature, it could be something seemingly benign, but then when implemented, brings about injustices that involve pretty serious harms, like death to migrants who are trying to cross the border, like whether through the desert or by water. And I think that I'm not saying you're making this error, but I think that I want to reinforce that just because I make the distinction between direct and indirect, I don't mean to suggest that indirect is any less harmful. Like, I don't think it's any less bad. I think they are equivalently bad. And I think the distinction is a meaningful one insofar as it allows us to see that there are immigration policies that may seem innocent at the very first blush, but end up having these downstream
egregious consequences. And I think it's meaningful to be able to make a distinction between the two. I think by collapsing everything into direct injustice, I'm worried about losing the more fine-grained story you can tell about how like particular policies lead to particular unwanted consequences. So I think that's my way of pushing back against that comment. And about the question about legitimacy, that's a really tough one. And I think I'm split on this issue myself. There's a pragmatic part of me that wants to say, well, I didn't touch on this simply because it would have led me into this like really scary zone, like where I would have to deal with reviewers who would question me about the very fundamentals of authority and, legitimacy and so on and so forth. So I just didn't really want to touch that. And I think that was a kind of laziness on my part for sure. I was like, I don't want to get into that. I'm just going to make some qualifiers. But I think I do actually have views on this topic that I don't elucidate in the book. And I think now would be a great time to maybe like try to make sense of them. I think I want to say that the current frameworks that we're given, I think you talk about Hobbes, I don't think they really capture what social political life is like under non-ideal circumstances. And I want to say that states can retain some form of legitimacy, even if they do commit injustices. And I think we can, so I think a very helpful way of looking at this is Michael Blake's distinction between ideal and non-ideal approaches to justice. And he says, well, with an ideal approach, you would think about constructing society from the ground up. So just, in the case of like Rawls and Dworkin and the ideal theory guys. And what exactly society would need to look like if we were to rebuild it, for example, behind the veil of ignorance, to be perfectly just and have the kind of legitimacy and just like justifiability that we want it to. But then, because we already live in a world that's so tarnished by injustice, the non-ideal approach would simply say, okay, we have these existing institutions that are clearly unjust and non-ideal. They fail the the ideal tests in so many ways. There's like non-compliance. There are like often no resources to like ensure that people are indeed treated justly. So what can we do like within these confines to make things more just? And I think that's very much the framework I'm operating within. And so I don't want to say that we should throw legitimacy totally out of the window just because there are laws, and indeed many laws, that I would regard as unjust or impermissible. And to be clear, I think there are limits. I think I can't specify the exact limit. This would be a whole endeavor unto itself, but there are definitely points in which a society can become so unjust that it does become illegitimate. So I want to just put that out there. And one thing I've often asked students in like both my undergraduate and grad seminars is, if we take refugees to be people who have a claim to leave their country and join a new country because their human rights are being violated, could we not say the same thing about, say, Black Americans who face human rights violations because of police brutality? And they're often kind of like, whoa, we didn't think of it that way. And so I think that's just like a kind of thought that I just want to introduce for everyone to think about. But then I think there's also the side of me that's maybe more conservative and wants to say that I do believe in a duty to obey the law. And I think that we still have this duty to an extent because I've always been convinced by the duty of fair play and reciprocity, right? That fundamentally being in a society together means engaging in social cooperation where we both benefit from social cooperation. We also have to give and take at the same time. It can't just be taking. And so I think that I would not want to jump to the radical conclusion that just because immigration laws are unjust, we don't need to pay like our parking fines, for example, although I would actually love for that to be the case. So I think that's my answer to the question. So I think that we should think of legitimacy as maybe a scalar feature, like rather than something that's like absolute or yeah, so that's my answer. And then I'll move on to Leo's comments about brain drain and autonomy. So I think maybe this is where I can plug my second book project a little bit more. It mainly exists in my imagination at the moment, but I'm very interested in the right to free movement, not just in terms of being able to move where you want, but also having the right to remain where you are, which I think is also an exercise of free movement. Insofar as when we think about the right to bodily autonomy, that encompasses being able to do what you want in your body, but also like not having things done to you or not wanting to do certain things. It's still the same. We're still talking about the same right in question. And so I've begun to think more about, I guess, less, even though this book is very highly analytic, in line with my training, I've begun to consider more phenomenological approaches to the freedom of movement and why it's so important to us. I'm deeply unsatisfied by typical liberal arguments for free movement, such as those espoused by Kieran Oberman. So essentially, Oberman argues that we have a right to free movement because we have plans and projects that may take place in different countries, and we can only access those plans and projects, like joining a different religion or like marrying the person you love, if you have the right to free movement. And importantly, he has another paper following that chapter where he argues for the right to remain, and that also speaks directly to brain drain. But I found myself unsatisfied with that argument because, and I do talk about this in the book, although not in very much detail, because it seems to have this leveling down approach where it seems that if you want to think of free movement as this like general global liberal principle, then we could talk about, say, a white Swedish engineer's right to free movement to the U.S., like in exactly the same terms as the freedom of movement of an indigenous Latinx person wanting to move to the U.S., and I just don't think the cases are the same at all. And so I think that's not really answering your question, but I want to affirm here that I think there is really something to be said about the right to remain. I don't know like how much empirical that there is out there on what people's preferences are, but my general impression is that people would actually rather be where they are, and they often leave only because they can't find the opportunities they want within their home countries. And I think there is something to the idea of simply being at home, being where you are that's comfortable, feels safe to you, that goes above and beyond the simple liberal argument, right? I might want to stay where I am, not just because my plans and projects are there. I could have plans and projects that are like all over the world, but there's still something about my home and the feeling of being at home that I think is incredibly valuable. And so that's something that I aim to explore in my next book project. So that's like a non-answer, but it's just like, I guess, an invitation for more thoughts on this topic. And I want to say that maybe another tension that both of you spoke to was really about what rights states have in violating our autonomy and telling us what we can do. And my intuition, and this comes out very strongly in the book, has always been that states do not have the right to tell us what to do, and we should be able to go wherever we want on our own terms. And I find the idea of being made to remain in my home country to perform labor to be incredibly disturbing. So I have a very strong intuitive resistance to that, and I think it may be one that's shared by other people on this panel, although I would be very interested to hear what the audience thinks about this. But then I'm also willing to accept that, right, like there are often cases where it's not just supererogatory. Like we might be, the demands, since I'm somebody who's so into the idea of social cooperation, reciprocity, there could indeed be situations where even though I don't really want to do something, it's not purely voluntaristic. I just have to do it because if I don't do it, nobody else will, right? And I think part of why I'm so allergic to the idea of remaining in my home country to do labor for them is that I'm a philosopher. They don't need philosophers there, like if they just don't. And I think they would not like to have philosophers there. And if I were a doctor and I knew that my presence meant that, say, X number of people would have a much lower chance of survival just because many people like me were moving to the US and UK and so on and so forth, I think my reaction would be very different. But notice here that, again, it's not really about states' rights to tell us what to do. I think it just goes back to autonomy. So I think I'm really, in like just thinking out loud, I'm saying that I agree with you that it has a lot to do with individual autonomy. And I think it's pretty important to assert the value of individual autonomy, particularly when we're operating within, a philosophical context where autonomy gets kind of short-shrifted sometimes as something that's just like a product of the Enlightenment, and like, it's like these like wealthy white men who like were able to like be autonomous, and like whereas everyone else just had to do like labor that they didn't really have a choice in doing or not doing. But I want to push back against that and say that, I don't know, like autonomy is pretty important. I think everyone should have autonomy, and one of the fundamental problems with that critique of the Enlightenment is that I think it's not about throwing autonomy out of the picture. It's about making sure that everyone like is able to enjoy autonomy. So I think that's me strongly agreeing with both of you. And so I guess I'll pause very briefly to make a note about colorism before talking more about brain drain. So I want to say that the point about colorism was particularly well taken because the book is very intersectional in its aims. I make a point of saying that, right, it's not just about, when I first began to write about low-skilled and high-skilled migration, one of the most common critiques I would get by reviewers would be, why not just write about low-skilled and high-skilled workers? Why migrants in particular? And so I needed to really flesh out the notion that being a low-skilled migrant is a distinct social identity that's different from simply being a low-skilled worker. And you can be a low-skilled worker, say a blue-collar worker from Pennsylvania, where I dwell, and have a completely different experience of that. And not say like any less oppressive. I think there are many different oppressions, and we don't have engage in like oppression Olympics here. But having, being a low-skilled migrant and a highly skilled migrant, these are socially salient identities unto themselves. And I think that bringing in colorism it just makes sense, because I think that that's helping me to refine the categories that I'm thinking about here and trying to fill out with more content. I think you're absolutely on the money that low-skilled migrants are more likely to be people, right, who are indigenous, who are not perceived as white. And I think adding that, if I had received these comments like a few years ago, I would definitely have incorporated them into the analysis. And so I think here I'll also like point to another theorist's work, and you can also meet her at the APA. So Amy Reed Sandoval has this amazing book called Socially Undocumented, where she talks about how even if you are a citizen and you're not undocumented, or if you're a migrant but you have all your papers in order, simply by racialized perception, you can be subject to the same kinds of oppression that undocumented people are. You face the same suspicion, you face the same discrimination, or you face the same risk of being harmed or being threatened by violence just because of the way you look. And so I think that's another like pretty potent resource to look at if this is a question that's interesting to you, and I think it should be. Brain drain more broadly. I'm trying to organize my thoughts here. So another way, so we've talked about autonomy of migrants and how like I think it's central. I think we should be able to self-determine where we want to go. I don't think it's the business of states like to tell us what to do. And I think I have like a sneak libertarian side that's like really coming out here, but I'm just gonna own it. I've been teaching like a class on like Milton Friedman, like, so I'm like extra libertarian at the moment, but like in a good way, I promise. But so I think now I'll turn to states and their duties to former colonies and how this plays out in the realm of brain drain and all like the puzzles and tensions that it brings up that I think are really, really complex. And so I think, just to speak to your comments, right, like there's a question of whether states should grant free movement to migrants or whether they should just like pay reparations of some kind. This could be done in the form of like cash transfers, which I think are empirically proven to be the most effective. So direct cash transfers, so there's no chance of like corrupt governments like seizing the money and not like letting people have them. So yay, cash transfers, and maybe it doesn't have to be like an either or. Like it could be both, right? That there could be a comprehensive reparations program for just like decolonial justice, and I would be super on board with that way of looking at it. But at the same time, I think that one thing I really want to emphasize is that because, as I've been saying this whole time, we're operating within a non-ideal context, I think it's really, really difficult to come up with a right answer. And I think that it's precisely because of these like multiple overlapping structural injustices that really like shape and form our lives that we just simply can't really get out of. Which is why I think it's even more important to like emphasize like and really like stand by our autonomy and agency, because if we don't have that, like what do we have? I think we're just like often in a double bind, right? So Marilyn Fry has a paper where she talks about oppression as the double bind where, no matter what option you take, you're kind of screwed. And I think that is what's exactly the case here, right? Like you can either remain in your home country, endure poverty, and not be able to realize your aspirations or not be able to get the training you want to be the highly skilled migrant, to be the highly skilled worker of your own preference. Or you can go to a receiving state and get that, but also be treated in an incredibly oppressive way. And it just sucks for you all around. And I don't think there's any solution to that. It's just how things are. And I think that's something to really keep in mind, that, right, we're just dealing with fundamentally unjust circumstances. And often it's going to be a choice between like two not great things. It's down to you to figure out like which one you're like more willing to swallow. And so, yeah, I think I want to agree with you again that I think there can be great moral damage in deciding to migrate. And it's just something that you just kind of have to suck up, because I just don't really see any way around this. And I think I'll maybe conclude here and let you have like more to say. I'm definitely missing out on things that I like want to cover, but I'm like just scattered at the moment. But I want to say that I think there are things that can be done to make life better for migrants in general, and especially low skilled migrants, since they are the focal point of the book. And on one hand, so there's often this debate. And this I think comes out a bit in what I'm about to say, between redistribution and recognition. This paper by Nancy Fraser, where she talks about how when attending to injustice, there's like a recognition element to it, but also a redistribution element to it. And her worry is that by attending too much to recognition, and recognition is again something I talk about a lot in the book, we might lose track of redistribution. And I want to be sensitive to that, and I think that there are many things we can do to improve the lives of low skilled workers. So maybe we aren't like all screwed, right? We are screwed, but we can be a bit less screwed, like incrementally. But I think that realistically speaking, that's the best we can hope for. And I would want to point to cases where undocumented workers have successfully unionized. I think we all have a duty to support the fair treatment and just work protections and just basic labor protections of workers. I think that would make things a lot better. But I also think that there is a recognition component to it where, and I do allude to this in my conclusion, that I think the public just isn't educated enough about how important low-skilled workers are to the American economy. And we saw a bit of that only because of the pandemic and the fact that there were undocumented workers in this bizarre situation where they were undocumented and not supposed to be there, but at the same time designated formally as essential workers who had to continue working, or, where else would we get our strawberries from, right? So I think I would propose a public education campaign on just the value of low-skilled workers and how essential they are to the economy, and how I think there is like widespread recognition in official government documents that there is actually a very strong need, and we actually are in deficit of low-skilled migrants at the moment. Even though in political rhetoric, it's often presented to us as, oh, there are too many low-skilled migrants trying to enter the country, when in fact, it's actually the other way around. So I think, right, that there are things that can be done to mitigate these issues. And I think I'm going to stop here and, just open the table to more questions and comments and just like more thoughts.
My only question was whether you were subscribing to a scalar conception of legitimacy rather than a binary one. And I suspected you were going to say scalar. I kind of want to talk about how you get that from a liberal egalitarian framework, but maybe that could be, that seems like outside the scope of this. So, that's all I had.
I would say that that's definitely worth expanding on, although I don't know if I want to be the one to do the expansion. Hopefully someone's writing about that.
I guess my question also might be outside the scope, but thinking of the right to remain as a form of decolonial justice, what other things do you think might contribute to that? So if we're talking about financial contributions to ex-colonies and free movement, is there anything else that you have in your head that might, not to put solving the immigration crisis on you right now, but is there anything else you might think that might further a decolonial mission?
Definitely, but I don't know if those things fall within the purview of states, and I think this all speaks to the concern about what do states have duties to do? Like, do we want to risk this unpleasant creep into other areas of social life that would be better done by civil society? And I think if we're talking about just decolonial justice as a whole, I would say that colonial mentalities, colonial mindsets are definitely they still play a very big role in our social life and how we perceive social phenomena, and there has to be an undoing of that. But I just don't think the government is what's the instrument that's most useful for this task. It's more about civil society and organizing and solidarity to achieve that. When it comes to the state, I just think that free movement and reparations would probably be a good example of that. I'm trying to think if there are any other things that I think states can do without overstepping their boundaries. Again, I'm being very Milton Friedman here. I think that's about it. But I would be very happy to hear your thoughts on this.
No, I think that's right, though. I think saying that it's kind of a fine line to toe between what the state should be doing and what should have kind of communal or grassroots ways of correcting the issues that are going on. But yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, so originally I had my critiques, but I got now sucked into the scalar talk. So I'm wondering, you mentioned how there's a duty to obey the law. You mentioned that. And you also mentioned how there's also this sense of autonomy. I don't know if it's a thick sense of autonomy and the strong sense, or a thin sense of autonomy, but I take that it's on the stronger side. So I'm wondering, with this given of a scalar of legitimacy that you believe should be taken into account, is there also a scalar of disobedience such that individuals in a state, and they stand in relation to other citizens, there's laws that are obeyed, and such laws can be unjust, or perhaps the nature of the state at a given point is unjust. Citizens feel a need to disobey. Is there then a scalar of disobedience such that it also challenges the legitimacy of the state? Do you believe that? And do immigrants have some kind of stakeholdership too to challenge the legitimacy of a state? Or is their autonomy fully in the thick sense such that they can, because they're not considered citizens by the state, just have a right to challenge at all times the legitimacy? I'm just curious as to whether or not that scalar on the converse of disobedience exists in the same way.
Those are really excellent, deep questions. And I think my response to this is going to be maybe like disappointingly just not very original, in that I think that our autonomy is often best realized in a state where laws are obeyed. And right, like, so if we just think about things like right, like bodily autonomy, like we are not going to be autonomous if we fear for our lives. Right, and so my interests in, I don't know where this places me in, right, like I guess when it comes to like theorists of political obligation and the duty to obey the law, but I do think that I'm oriented towards obeying the law insofar as it serves our being able to flourish as autonomous agents. And I think that despite the fact that there are many unjust laws, like seemingly, I think if we just like came with a list right now, we just keep going on and on and on and on with like things that are really like terrible and things that are really banal at the same time. But I want to say that there are still laws that are really vital to the preservation of our autonomy. And so I think what's maybe like a nuance that I didn't even know that I maybe had picked up on in the book was that when I talk about migratorial disobedience, I'm not arguing for anarchy in the sense of like just like, you know, not caring about the state or just like moving away from that and just saying that, you know, we should just like not follow law and order because that's like antithetical to us being autonomous agents. I mean, that would be very much in the vein of philosophical anarchism, like, you know, the thought of Wolf and whatnot. But I'm interested in laws that in changing immigration laws so that it accounts for these injustices and it prevents them from happening. And so I'm interested in, or rather I'm invested in, I want to say I'm more than interested, I'm invested in migratorial disobedience insofar as it contributes to a society where we become much more aware of how severe the extent of immigration injustice is, and laws will become changed as a result. And I think it takes sometimes like really drastic action, like we saw with the civil rights movement, in order for that to even happen. But the goal ultimately is still to reach a point where we have a society with just laws. So I hope that clarifies. That's good. Thank you.
Okay, any questions from the audience? And the Zoomies are also welcome to ask questions, and we've got someone who will share those with us. Okay.
Hi, Dr. Lim. I was part of the reading group. I know we already talked, but I really enjoyed getting to read your book. I know that you had mentioned that in the process of taking this from your dissertation and then turning it into an actual book, and then also kind of switching everything around, you said that you could have kept going like on, and I know some chapters got taken out, but I know it's a recent book, but if you were to do it again, was there anything you would have wanted to like elaborate on more or like add to?
That's a really great point. I think I don't really foresee there being a second edition of this book because it's just like not that important. But if there were anything I were to add, I think right, like I was saying earlier, I wish I had heard the colorism thing like a few years ago, because I think that would have been very valuable to put in when I'm engaging in my analysis of these different socially subordinated identities, and how, you know, there's something not just about being a migrant, but also like your skin color, that the way you look, that contributes to that. And it's also an objection that has been raised to me many times, right, like by in particular African American students who say like, well, I know like lots of Latinos who like are completely white passing and definitely like have in the past benefited from affirmative action, but then they don't actually like suffer any oppression. In fact, if anything, like they're the descendants of like the actual like colonizers. And I think that is, it's not an easy point to make, right? It's like a challenging one, but I think there is like a lot of truth to that. So I think if I go back in time, I would want to be more attentive to these dimensions in the book. And I think that, I don't know how this would have fit in, but the the fourth chapter, which focuses on gender, I was writing that in a time where we had a much more simplistic notion of what gender was. This is way before. I think I wrote that chapter in 2014, actually, like 10 years ago, before I became much more aware of trans philosophy and thinking about gender in a much more multifaceted way. And I think I would have liked to do justice to that, because it was extremely awkward doing my revisions of that chapter and like saying like female migrants and feeling very awkward. And I'm like, what are the words can I use? Like woman identified migrants. So that was complicated. So I think that's something I would have liked to be more attentive to as well. Yeah.
Hi, Dr. Lim. This is going to probably be very jumbled, but you just touched on it, the kind of gender chapter, the section 2 of the selective skill immigration. And then you also touch on this in the conclusion, where you kind of talk about like the skilled women migrants who are nurses, like from the Philippines, right? And they're kind of brought over in positions of care, and then also how skilled migrants aren't demeaned in the same way as like low skilled migrants. And you touched, I'm going all over the place, so I'm going to stick with this one point. You touched on this with the I can't pronounce his name correctly, but the example from the UK where they got repatriated to Australia. There's kind of this like demeaningness that comes with just operating in the system of immigration policy outside of borders that affects all like skilled immigrants, regardless of low or high skill. Do you have anything else to say on that? Like I would like noticed it through the chapters, but it wasn't really like touched on.
I do actually, and it's so I don't know if any of you remember this, but I mentioned very much earlier in my remarks that I have a forthcoming paper that, again, revisions are like very late for, and I'm going to be working on them during the AP in my hotel room. But it touches on exactly this topic, and I can't even recall the title of the paper, but it has to do with what I call microaggressions and macroaggressions during the process of border crossing. And so in that paper, which I'd be very happy to share a draft version with you of like, because I think it's pretty okay, like even without the revisions, which I think are kind of unnecessary, but never mind. I basically argue that by passing through borders, we are often, to varying degrees, of course, dependent on our social identities, exposed and rendered vulnerable to things that are deeply demeaning to us. And so I do, I have like more, I guess, like work on this and like the whole like Lim canon, like that will touch on this. And I have to admit that paper was inspired by my own extremely entitled outrage by being like people being really rude to me at like not Ontario, like in the SoCal sense, but like I forget the name of that stupid airport, but it's a Toronto one. I hate that airport. They are so rude to you at the border, and I was subjected about like 1,000 microaggressions like on the same day. So that was like really the purpose of the paper. Like that was what like animated the paper. And I'll just say to the people in this room who do philosophy, I feel like if you're anything like me, what's most motivational is like reading an argument and getting angry about it, and then that like really gives you the force to like move forward with an argument. And I think this book was like very much like driven by anger, but like I guess it was somewhat hopefully productive kind.
Is there a kind of a limit on the number of immigrants that the United States and Europe can accommodate? And is there a way that maybe someone like the Peace Corps or something like that, the students go into the country and create conditions where people are happy enough in the country not to immigrate?
Absolutely. So I think that even though the open borders position is very much maligned, and right, you're left with the impression, you in the general sense, not you specifically, that it just means like it's a free for all and people can start like moving wherever they want. I would say that every single proponent of open borders, such as people like Joseph Cairns, Philip Cole, Kieran Oberman, all specify that there can be limitations on just how many people a country can take in, because beyond a certain limit, it's just going to make life worse for everyone because of, say, issues of overcrowding, a rise in property prices, gentrification. There's so many other issues to consider when I think going about an open borders policy. And so I would probably, but while identifying myself as a quasi like open borders theorist, I would say that I'm a cautious one in that I would want to be really attentive to what kind of like consequences open borders could have. And I think it just seems quite clear to me that for an open borders policy to be successful, insofar as the people migrating are able to have good lives and don't end up, living in banlieues or like things like that, we would have to be attentive to numbers. So definitely. And there's also some like element of like triage as well, right? Because we have to differentiate between refugees as well as people who are migrating for economic opportunities. And I think that there also could be cases where, say, if there's like a particular quota, then maybe more priority should be given to refugees, and I don't have a problem with that either. I think that's a sensible thing to do, but I definitely could not produce numbers. I don't think anybody can really. I think it would really have to, any number would be, I think at this point, when we haven't really studied it enough, like in the empirical, that any number would be arbitrary. And I am pretty afraid of arbitrary quotas and numbers. So that's my answer to the first question. And I'm sorry, can you remind me of the second question again?
It was about like Peace Corps or other organizations going to like ex-colonial countries, for example. So you could sort of think about it as a third option, but in addition to reparations and free movement is what about offering volunteers or...
Yeah, so, right. Thanks, Alex. So that's also, I think just in going about thinking about these issues, I don't want to be tethered to any particular like strong ideological opinion. I know that the idea of Peace Corps like entering countries could quite fairly and rightly be seen by many people as a kind of paternalism or a form of neo-colonialism where it's still intervention that shouldn't be okay if we're going to accept that the country, that developing country is a sovereign entity. But then I don't think that there's like a one rule fits all thing that's like operational in such cases, because again, like one thing I've emphasized throughout is how difficult and complex all these issues are, and I could foresee situations where the presence of Peace Corps like could be something that would be good for the country, but I would still again like proceed with caution, and I probably want to just adopt the precautionary principle when it comes to things like that.
Awesome. I'm going to insert myself in the queue. So I'm also a huge fan of the book. And I definitely want to push back on you selling the book short. I definitely hope there's a second edition. And I kind of wanted to, pull out some of what I think are some of the most interesting contributions. So like in the academic space, it's often like open borders or not, which of course has, in some cases, has like very little to do with like practical debates, like what's actually happening in terms of, different countries and what actual sort of debates they're having about migrant policies. But it's in the latter, it's often taken for granted that it's like, well, of course we want to have like quote unquote high skilled immigration. We want to bring the doctors and the lawyers and so on. And I just really love how your book explores other options where we might want to like turn that on its head. Maybe we should be restricting the high skilled immigration and be opening up a lot more to the low skilled migration, which is really an inversion of the standard kind of debate. And from the standpoint of justice, maybe that's the more fair thing to do. And so you're really like opening up different options that folks hadn't thought of. And so and another one is like maybe rather than like a blanket open borders policy, colonizer states have open border policies specifically to the states that used to be their colonies. And so there's like pockets of open borders that are sort of anchored in particular claims about justice. And so that's like a whole wide range of different questions that hadn't, at least for me, not being an expert in this area, hadn't really been on my radar. So, thank you for that. And my question is just, I guess, like, have you thought about, trying to write like an op-ed or something about that, like doing more kind of public facing work to kind of expand the public's imagination about the range of possibilities we might have when it comes to thinking about migration justice?
Definitely. I love doing podcasts because I enjoy. You can maybe tell that I really.
You're on one right now.
Yeah, I really enjoy the sound of my own voice, which is something you kind of need, I think, if you're going to be a professor. But yeah, I would be very happy to do that. I think the only thing that's really, again, this is like real talk. Something that stopped me from doing that in the past is really just the demands of tenure. And now that I have tenure, like I am much more free to do much more of that kind of, I guess, like public facing work. And I have begun to do it. So this is more about my second book, more so the fake second book that doesn't exist, but we can all pretend it does exist. I did write a piece for The Conversation about home ownership, because home ownership and gentrification are also going to play pretty important roles in my second book on the freedom of movement, because I think of gentrification and people being forced out of their homes as a violation of freedom of movement. And so that's an example of work that I've done on that issue. So I'm hoping to be able to do more now that I'm like free and have more autonomy.
Congrats on tenure. I didn't realize you got tenure.
I just found out.
Round of applause.
So in your epilogue, you talk a lot about what these conditions look like post-COVID, specifically about like immigrants' increasing vulnerabilities to socially subordinating treatments. So I want to kind of connect that back to what we've been talking about today in terms of state versus like civil responsibilities for these conditions. So I was kind of wondering, like, with the increasing like social stigma, particularly around immigrants surrounding COVID, like how would you delegate out those responsibilities versus like what responsibility does the state owe to those people who are now facing increased social stigma, and then what if that can be delegated up to civil responsibility?
So I think my initial response would be, I actually don't know if the part about social stigma applies anymore, because it's like COVID out of nowhere, you know? I think maybe that would have been something, I mean, demonstrably true when we were at peak COVID, and there was an increase in violence against Asian or Asian American people in particular, because they got blamed for COVID. Although I have to admit, I laughed when Trump said it was the Kung flu. I thought that was extremely funny. So, oh god, I'm being recorded saying that, but
we'll edit it in post. Don't worry.
And maybe you can keep that in. It's up to you. And but maybe edit out the Milton Friedman stuff. Anyway. But I think, right, but just to kind of take that for granted, I just don't think that states can do very much in the way of decreasing social stigma. And I think sometimes just because of how allergic people are to messaging that comes from the state and the level of distrust in the state, and also distrust extending to mainstream media that is now seen by many, I think quite, again, fairly so. I'm not just talking about the Pizzagate people, but right, like I think I myself began to get really disillusioned, like during COVID, about what was being reported. And I think this moment happened when Fauci, went on record saying that it was okay to go back to work within 5 days of testing positive, and we all knew that you were definitely still contagious within 5 days, and that was clearly just something said to make people go back to work. And so I think because we're like going back to the theme of non-ideal theory and non-ideal situation, and how we're all in this double bind, I just don't think that any messaging about the state, right, that even if it's sincerely motivated, even if it's done by the best like PR campaign to make you think better of low-skilled migrants, I think it might actually have the exact opposite effect, because it's coming from the state. And so I think I'd be much more inclined to say that it's the role of civil society to do that, and not the state, simply because of the particular circumstances we are in vis-a-vis our relation to the state.
I think there's a bit of an inherent conflict between what you're saying here and democracy. And the reason is in a democracy, citizens are going to vote in a way where policies are going to favor themselves and the country that they're in at the moment, and the people in the country that they're in at the moment, and probably not favor very many people across the sea. But it seems here that you are proposing a more universalist morality in some sense. So how do you think this conflict can be resolved?
Yeah, I have a pretty ready answer for that. And I think it really depends on your conception of democracy, right? Because you could be, I guess, a nationalist about democracy and be pretty firm in saying that it's only the people who live within that territory who have the right to have a say or have a vote on a particular issue. But I think even that lends itself to quite surprising conclusions, because if we think about who inhabits the state, who's subject to its laws, who is subject to its coercion, who contributes to the economy and keeps it afloat, Michael Walzer has a really great passage on that in Spears of Justice that has really stuck with me, and which I cite in the book. That does include immigrants and non-citizens and denizens, and not just citizens alone. So I think even going with the traditional account of it has to be whoever resides within the territory, you would still have a pretty strong case for extending democratic rights. And this is not a radical idea. So even though I'm not British, I had the right as a Commonwealth citizen in the UK to participate in EU elections, as well as local and national elections. So that's something that does not exist in America and seems to be kind of off the table, but it's something that does exist in other parts of the world. And I guess just to give you an idea of other ways of thinking about democracy and the right to vote, there are some theorists who believe in, so they call it something like all affected interests. So basically, as long as your interests are affected by a particular issue in the state. So for example, if a new economic policy is going to affect you, even though you live on the other side of the world, you would, in principle, have a right to have your say or at least contribute your voice on this issue. And the theory that I argue for in a paper that I wrote in 2017 and barely remember, but this part I guess I feel quite strongly about. I propose a stakeholder principle. I guess account of democratic theory, where I say that it's not just about having your interests affected, because that could, given the U.S. and just how influential it is power, that would maybe give everyone in the world the right to vote in American elections, and that just seems to be a conclusion you want to avoid, because it just seems incredibly impractical and implausible and counterintuitive. I want to say that there are certain conditions wherein you can say that a person has a stake in the future of a particular country, and there are various factors that can give you such a stake. So in that paper I'm referencing, I talk about refugees and how they have a stake in remaining in particular regions of Europe rather than simply being sent anywhere, because that's a really big issue about where to put refugees. And so I want to say that if you have a stake in the future of a country, that's more than just being affected. It's having part of your identity bound up with what happens with the country. And I think we should move forward with the stakeholder principle. And if we did so, the consequence of that would be that there are people outside the U.S., right, who have a very strong interest in moving to the U.S. to better their opportunities and escape violence and poverty. And I would say that they probably qualify as people who are stakeholders and should have the right to say something about it. And I think I want to add as well in this rather rambling answer that I think voting is just one part of democracy, and we should be thinking about other things as well. I'm a big fan of deliberative democracy, so I think that even if you don't want to go as far as saying that immigrants from Honduras have the right to vote, they should at least be given. I think the state is obliged to provide them with forums where they can express their views and make them known to the public and correct the democratic deficit when it comes to immigration that I reference in my final chapter.
I'll ask a question which will seem somewhat off topic, but okay. In discussing the question of trying to retain high-skilled migrants in their home country, I wonder if the example of the failure to do so in East Germany might not be a good avenue to consider these things. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
I'll be honest and say that while I spend a lot of my time in Germany, I have not actually looked into this, and that seems like a pretty fruitful path to go down. I haven't thought about it from that point of view, but I've been particularly, I have an undergrad assistant working on this issue for me. So Berlin in particular has very strong anti-gentrification laws, and so I've been looking to that as possibly a model for what I can propose policy-wise in my new book. But I haven't thought about the particular case that you just mentioned, and could you maybe elaborate on that a bit more so I know what to Google?
One of the folks on Zoom, Connor Ruiz, asks if stakeholders should participate in democracy. Should and you say we not tend towards a larger aggregation of power? How can those be reconciled?
I guess I want some clarity on what they mean by a larger aggregation of power, by the state or by non-citizens. My best guess would be aggregation of power from non-citizens, right? I feel like that would be more in vein with the question. Yeah, although I could be wrong.
Yeah, something like the rest of the world gains power over the country.
Yeah, so I actually don't really have a problem with this because I think that I do think the Westphalian model of sovereignty, right, it's a construct that emerged at a very particular time, and I think that we live in this increasingly globalized world where many of these assumptions are just kind of defunct, and I think we have to accept that we live in a world where states interact with each other on this very, very intimate everyday level, something we simply take for granted that may not be immediately visible to us, but it's always just like taking place. And I would go even further and say that I think the main sites of power now are not so much even states themselves, but multinational corporations that really determine how things shake out in the end. Please do not ask me to elaborate on that point. But so I want to say that, right, like if you want to subscribe to the old model of Westphalian sovereignty, then I can see why you might feel uncomfortable at the idea of non-citizens having power and determining a state's policy. But I just don't think that we live in that world anymore. And just like, given present circumstances, we have to be open to the possibility of basically reorganizing political life and rethinking like central premises that just don't really apply anymore. Maybe the sovereignty problem is especially an issue for developing countries, like given that we have an interest in avoiding neo-colonialism. And so I think then I would go back to what I said earlier about how I think that it's not a matter of like I think I have to be quite careful in specifying the stakeholder principle so that it doesn't cover all people who have an interest in joining the state. Like it's got to be more demanding than that, because I don't think that, for example, right, like I'm always using the boogeyman here of like the really wealthy like Swedish software engineer, having a stake and moving to this developing country. I just don't think that is on par at all. I don't think it's the same kind of case as the kinds that I'm interested in my book. And so I want to be careful with how I would specify the stakeholder principle. It can't just be about an interest in moving there. It's got to be something deeper than that.
Thank you, everybody, so much. If you haven't filled out the survey yet, please do so, and you've got a chance to win a signed copy. So please join me in thanking Dr. Lim, Dr. Garcia, and Leo and Luis.
Thank you so much, everyone. This was a real pleasure.
On behalf of CCEP, we'd like to thank the students who worked together over the past year to put together this podcast series, the guests who agreed to be interviewed and recorded for these episodes, and our CCEP faculty fellows for their ongoing advice. A special thanks also to the Cal Poly Pomona Special Projects for improving the Classroom Experience Grant Program for making this series possible. And finally, once again, thank you so much for listening.